Hi, this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And I have a wonderful story today. This is fantastic. I have Bill Morris here, and we are going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects. And this is so much fun. I'm going to be talking about Detroit. Oh, this is so much fun. And I'm going to be talking about the Lions. Now, Bill, it's so great to have you here. And I love this book. It's not just about the Lions, it's about Detroit. And it's so much about the fans who have stuck with the Lions all these years. I lived in Europe for many years. And
Uh-huh.
over there this is before internet, so we didn't get news so easily. The only English newspaper we'd read was the International Herald Tribune, and they didn't care anything about the Lions. But whenever I'd see an American with an American newspaper or magazine, I'd run up to them and I'd say, "What's happening with the Tigers? What's happening with the Lions?" And they were always so surprised. I was born in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, of course, and so I'm a Youper. We moved to Detroit when I was very young, actually to Highland Park. I have such fond memories of Highland Park and Detroit in general. My father took me to a lot of Tigers games, but love the Lions. The fans for the Lions are so loyal year after year. And this is a very famous Superman, Donnie Stefanski. And I know his daughter is still carrying on the tradition. They have a restaurant up in the UP. And I thought, this is just for all of us fans who never gave up hope. And now we are happy.
I met her, Jackie
Yeah.
Stefanski. I met her at the season kickoff game against the Rams at Ford Field. She still sits in the same seat where her dad and she had sat for years and years. He went to 200 consecutive Lions games in Detroit, drove down from the U every Sunday morning and became a legendary fan. And his daughter is still carrying on the tradition.
That's what makes Lions fans special. And so this book comes out, I think, at the right time. A few years ago, it might not have had the same title, but
It's funny that you mentioned that because when I started writing the book back in 2021, a year after Sheila Ford Hemp had taken over the team, one of the reasons I started writing the book was not only did I have a lot of the history in my head and in a recording from my father, but after Sheila took over the team and brought in this exciting new general manager and head coach, Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell, and I thought, wow, maybe the Lions are going to finally get good here after her father and mother had not done much with the team. And then they lost their first 10 games that first year. And then the next year they were 1-5 to start the season. And that's when I started writing the book. And my original title, it's funny that you mentioned this, Patsy. My original working title was Natural Born Losers. And that was
I
going to
wouldn't
be
be talking to you today if you did that.
it was going to be a story about this cultural futility, this organizational futility that had been going on for 60 years. They'd had a few glimmers of almost greatness over the years, but it was just a relentless futility. And like you say, the fans stuck with them, but it was a dark time. And then when Sheila took over and it was more of the same, I thought, I got to write this book. But then, of course, in the course of writing the book, things changed. They did indeed turn it around and now almost went to the Super Bowl last year. And now it's a completely different ending to the book than the one that I had envisioned when I started writing it.
We waited a long time for this and deserve now after over 50 years. And we'll talk about why that's so relevant because first we'll mention it. William Clay Ford, of course, he bought the team and you have a relationship through your father. Do you want to
Right.
tell us about that?
Yeah, that was the genesis of the book. And my father accepted a job at Ford Motor Company the year I was born, 1952. He was a reporter at the Washington Post, and he came to Detroit right after I was born and spent 17 years working at Ford Motor Company. And 10 of those years, he was the what they called executive assistant, the personal PR guy for William Clay Ford Sr. And they became very close, traveled a lot together all over the world. My father was involved in promoting the Continental Mark II, which was Bill Ford's dream car, which his brother Henry killed, which led him to by the Lions because it was a sort of an alternative career for him. And my father was there when all of this was happening. He was there the day that Bill Ford bought the team, November 22nd, 1963, as it happens, the day that John Kennedy was assassinated. And I had sat down with my father late in his life and tape recorded his reminiscences about his life. And a lot of that was about the Ford Motor Company, the Detroit Lions, Detroit. And that's where the book was born. Going back and listening to those tapes after 25 years, when I got the idea to do the book, I realized what a gold mine I'd been sitting on and didn't even realize it after all these years. And so those interviews with my father became the sort of the seed from which the book sprouted.
Now, of course, explain the relationship of Ford. Now, he is the youngest grandson.
Yeah, William Clay Ford was the youngest of four children of Edsel Ford, who was Henry Ford's only child. Edsel had four kids. Henry II was the eldest, and Bill was the baby. And Henry and Bill never got along very well, from everything I've heard. And Henry, of course, took over the company at the end of World War II when it was about to fall apart. Henry, their grandfather, had railroaded their father into an early grave, and the government was about to take over the Ford Motor Company because they were afraid it was so vital to the war effort. They were afraid it was going to fail and that the war effort would suffer. But Henry II was released from the Navy early and went back to Detroit and brought the company back from the grave. Baby brother Bill and his other brother Benson didn't ever really have a place inside the company. And when Henry killed the Continental Mark II, which I talked about earlier, that my father worked on, when Henry killed that car at the advice of the bean counters like Robert McNamara, who ended up becoming the president of Ford Motor, and then, of course, the Secretary of Defense, who did the wonderful work with the Vietnam War. These guys killed that beautiful car because it was losing money. Every time they sold a car, they lost $1,000. It was just it was a status thing, and Bill Ford wanted to bring up the image of Ford Motor Company and all the products by having this elegant product. They weren't hearing it, and so they killed the car, and that sort of drove Bill out of the company, not entirely. He held a position. He was on the board of directors, but he was a figurehead. And the old adage was there's only room for one Ford in the Ford Motor Company. When Henry and Edsel were butting heads, that was obvious then. And when Henry II and Bill were butting heads, and Benson, it was also obvious. So Benson and Bill went away. Bill ended up buying the Lions, and that became his fallback position. And he ran the team for 50 years with limited, as being from Michigan, limited success.
We have some photos here that you sent in, and you can talk about them, okay? Just give us some background here.
Go ahead. Oh, this is great. Now, this is 2003. The gentleman on the left is the great George Plimpton, who walked on and played quarterback in 1963 during the training camp and wrote the great book Paper Lion, which was published a few years later. But 1963 was the year that he was with the team. And at 40 years later, he was invited back to Ford Field for a 40th reunion. The guy in the middle is Alex Karras, who was suspended that year for gambling on games along with Paul Hornung of the Green Bay Packers. And the guy on the right, of course, is William Clay Ford, the owner of the team, who is getting on in years, as you can see. But those three guys were huge factors in the Lions over the years. And I think that's a wonderful picture. George Plimpton died of a heart attack, I think 3 or 4 days later. He just dropped dead. And that was his last moment in the sunshine. And he's a wonderful writer. I've just been reading a couple of his books just recently, and he's a great writer. His son, Taylor, interestingly enough, Taylor Plimpton, who became a lifelong Lions fan because of his father's writing that book. Taylor now lives outside of New York City, and he wrote a really nice blurb for my book. He liked it a lot, so I was touched by that. So the book has a kind of a little bit of a link with the Plimpton family and George there on the left.
It is. It's a great photo. Oh, wow. Now here, it goes back in time a little bit.
Yeah. Now that's an old, I think it was called Navin Field at the time, where the Tigers played. Then it was later became Briggs Stadium and then Tiger Stadium, where the Lions eventually played. And there's this photo, I think, tells great stories. The gentleman on the far left is Edsel. Sitting next to him is his father, Henry. And Henry doesn't look very happy, does he? He doesn't like being at this baseball game. And Edsel seems like a handsome guy over there on the left, elegant, dapper, and he's having a good time with his kids. And there's young Bill Ford in the middle, probably about 10 years old, and his sister Josephine there on his left, and his mother, Clara, not Clara. I'm having a moment here. I can't remember his mother's name, but that's his mom on the far right. I don't know who the handsome lady is in the back, but there they are at a baseball game, and young Bill is obviously having a great time. But his grandfather, sitting to his right, looks like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than right there at that baseball. He'd probably rather be working on a new gear shift or something like that. But I think that's a very telling photograph about the dynamics of the Ford family, a very complicated, troubled family, but the wealth is unimaginable to us. And that picture right there to me speaks volumes about the family.
It does, and he looks so cute there. He does.
He resembled his father quite a bit. When he grew up, he looked a lot like Edsel there on the far left. That Bill looked a lot like that when he became a man, and everybody talked about how handsome both of those guys were when they were younger. And they were. They was always elegantly dressed and groomed and turned out, and you can see that in Edsel there on the left.
Exactly. But Bill had, I think, had a better taste in cars. The Continental Mark II was a beautiful car. The Edsel, not
Oh,
so
and
much.
no, the Edsel was a bad car, but that wasn't Edsel's fault. Edsel did the original Continental Mark I, which was one of the great cars Ford ever did back in the 30s. Bill's Mark II was an homage to his father, and I think the Mark II was the most beautiful car Ford Motor Company ever built. That's my personal opinion, but in the book I quote Bill saying that there was more attention to details spent on that car than anything I was ever involved in before or since. It was a beautiful piece of workmanship. They cost $10,000. Liz Taylor, Frank Sinatra, Elvis were among the first buyers. It was a big prestige thing, and he was trying to elevate the prestige of the company in homage to his father. And of course, the bean counters didn't want to hear it, and they killed the car, which kind of killed his spirit. And like I say, that's how he wound up with the Lions.
Okay, it worked out in some ways. Let's talk about Bobby Layne. Uh,
Okay, Bobby Layne was probably the greatest quarterback ever played for the Lions, one of the greatest players in the history of the league. And after they won the championship in 1957, the year that this picture was taken, Tobin wrote they crushed the Cleveland Browns in the championship game at Briggs Stadium in Detroit in December of 57. And the next year, after a couple of games, the coach traded Bobby Layne abruptly to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Bobby Layne was a legend in Detroit back in the 50s. The Lions won 3 championships and lost another in the course of the 1950s. They were the dominant team in the NFL. A lot of younger people won't know that, and a lot of older people don't even remember it. It was so long ago, but they were a powerhouse in the 1950s. And when Bobby Layne was traded away, he was shocked. The whole city was shocked. Most of the players on the team were furious about it. And there's one old urban legend in Detroit that a lot of old Detroit people know about, and I write about it in the book called The Curse. On his way out the door to go to Pittsburgh, Bobby Layne said, "This team's not going to win for another 50 years." And that became the curse of Bobby Layne, which was widely quoted in
oh,
Detroit over the years
oh,
when the Lions.
everybody believed it. I mean, everybody knew it. Everybody talked about it. And I've a little connection with Bobby Layne because, of course, that was my father's generation who loved Bobby Layne and knew him and watched his games were amazing, I guess. He was raised in Highland Park, Texas. And we lived in Highland
Mhm.
Park, which is part of Detroit. So there was that little connection. I always could remember him because of that connection.
Oh, that's
Because
funny. Another graduate of Highland Park, Texas high school was Matthew Stafford, the other great quarterback for the Lions, and 50 years later. He and Bobby Layne went to the same high school in Texas. I don't know if you knew that.
that I didn't know.
Obscure, a little obscure fact for you. But Tobin wrote there, the gentleman on the right who was had a brilliant game in that 1957 game. My father played a lot of cards and did a lot of drinking with Tobin wrote. And Bobby Layne had the reputation as being the real wild man and the big drinker and party animal. And he got popped for DWI in Detroit, and there was a big scandal. But Tobin wrote was no slouch. These guys were hard partying, hard living, hard drinking guys. And you wouldn't know it looking at them right there. They'd look like a couple of happy schoolboys, but they were tough old guys, those old NFL dudes.
They were, and look at him. He's so good looking.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, of course, the, the interesting thing about this photo is this is the point where Bobby Layne is in a cast because I heard about this, what happened. His leg was broken. Oh, it's just, I can't even think about it. in 3 places. What happened in that? How did that happen on the field?
It was a dirty hit by, I believe it was a guy from the Chicago Bears. And the season before, he had ended up the season injured as well. And 2 years in a row, when you're out at the end of the season, when you're most needed, I think that sort of played into the decision to let him go. I think people are getting tired of his carousing in Detroit. And George Wilson, the coach, he had this two quarterback system with Tobin Rote and him, and that wasn't working. They got off to a bad start in 1958. And Bobby Layne was getting old, and he was taking these hits. And when he was young, he was be okay, but now he was starting to age, and the injuries were starting to pile up. And I think that was a factor in the decision to let him go and go in a different direction. They brought in Earl Morrall as a backup for Tobin Rote, and he had a very up and down career, and then went on to win a Super Bowl with the Miami Dolphins, which a lot of Lions who got discarded wound up going on to great things with other teams. But that's another whole story, Patsy. It's for another time.
And what is this?
Whoa. Oh, yeah. That's a beauty. That was the Thanksgiving Day Massacre in 1962. I was there. I'll never forget it. The Lions scored the first 3 times they touched the ball. That's Bart Starr from the Green Bay Packers getting a big Detroit welcome from the fearsome foursome defensive line. And they just mauled the Packers that day. And it was the only loss the Packers had all year. The Lions wound up losing 2 games and therefore not winning the Western Division. They only had 2 teams to go to the playoffs. It was a 1-game playoff for the title back in those days. They didn't have the divisional setup. And so the Packers beat the Lions, came in second, as they did so many times in the 60s to the Packers. And that was that was one of the great days in Detroit Lion history right there. And I remember it. I was 10 years old, and it was like yesterday. I remember it was like, how can this be happening? These guys are like flawless. Every time they touched the ball, they scored. They mauled the Packer players. It was just a beautiful day to be a Lions fan, I'll tell you.
And of course, you mentioned Thanksgiving, and the Lions are famous for playing on Thanksgiving Day. I don't know when it started, but that was always a big thing in Detroit, that the Lions would be playing that on Thanksgiving. All the guys would go to the game, and all the women in those days would stay at home and get that turkey ready. And right?
I'm sure it's still like that today, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm not sure when. I think that tradition started back in the 30s. The Lions moved to Detroit from Portsmouth, Ohio, a struggling little franchise on the Ohio River. And they moved to Detroit in 1934 and won the championship in 1935. And I think they started playing on Thanksgiving in the 30s or maybe the 40s. I could be wrong. But I know that when I was a boy, it was a big tradition every year. We always went to the game on Thanksgiving Day. And the NFL tried to take that game away from the Lions. And that was one of the times when Bill Ford really shone and stood up to the rest of the owners and said, this is a tradition with us, and we're not going to give this game up. And they acquiesced and let the Lions keep that game. Of course, now they've added half a dozen other games that day, but the Lions continue to play every year on Thanksgiving Day. It's a ritual in Detroit.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite players when I did see some Thanksgiving Day games was always, I just love Bubba Baker.
Bubba Baker, oh yeah.
What a guy. And he has such a tremendous background, too, of what he did. Do you remember a little bit about him?
Yeah, I remember in my research, I don't remember seeing him play. I never saw him play in person, but in my research, I know that he was very unhappy with his contracts later in his career when he got to be quite good. And he had contract holdouts, and he put his house up for sale, and he was all ready to leave town. And he was really angry with Russ Thomas, who was the general manager, which is another sub story we can get into. But he was unhappy with Lions management, and that's the part of Al Baker that I know.
Well, he did those, what in football are called sacks, but he did those. I had the fun of later on in life knowing him when he lived in Florida and I lived in Florida.
That picture we just showed of Bart Starr from the Packers being mauled, that's a sack and a half right there. That's when the defensive linemen get through and snag the quarterback before he can throw the ball or hand it off. And that right there is a sack. And look at that. That's a quadruple sack.
It is a beautiful picture.
Yeah, and Bubba Baker was a notorious sacker. He got to a lot of quarterbacks like Hutchinson now. He's developing a reputation at that left defensive end right now.
I think he's great. So I just wanted to put that, because for us who love the Lions, and as I said, yours, after you leave Detroit, you're still, there's something about Detroit. It's so wonderful. We lived in Highland Park and then we moved to the suburbs. And every opportunity I would get on a bus and head into Detroit because that's where I felt I belonged. And particularly Highland Park, there's
Oh, yeah.
a library there, McGregor Public Library. And that was my library. But there was something about the city. You'd go to Greektown, you'd go to the theater, you'd go to Hudson's. Wow, it's special.
Well, yeah, you've really hit on something there, Patsy, and it's something a lot of people around the country don't understand about Detroit, and that is the magnetic pull it has on the people who grew up there or spent any period of their lives there. It's an amazing city, and not just the sports, not just the cars, but the architecture, the music, the clubs, the libraries, the museums, the Detroit Institute of Art, the history that is so fascinating about this city. And that's why I dedicated the book I dedicated it to the people of Detroit, because I wanted this to be a book about the people of Detroit. It's not just about their football team. It's about them and their attachment to their football team and their love for their city and their despair when the city went down. Now there's this like resurgence coming along now. That's really what I wanted the book to be about, not just about football. I wanted it to be about all that stuff.
It was and still is a very special city. Anybody who went to Hudson's department store never forgot it. It was just
Mhm.
the most wonderful store. It broke my heart when they destroyed it because they should have waited. Today, it would be one of the best stores in the country if they had
Oh, yeah.
just held on to it. But they destroyed so many of the wonderful buildings. But there are still, as you said, there are many great ones. Fisher Theater is still there, right? And of
Oh,
course,
yeah. The
Detroit
Guardian building,
Institute.
the Penobscot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the Detroit Institute of Art is one of the best. At least 2 days a week, I skipped high school with permission of the vice principal. I went to the Detroit Institute of Art, and I would spend all day there, and everybody knew me because I would be studying art. Think of all the rich people who donated art to that institute.
Oh, yeah. Edsel Ford was instrumental in getting the Diego Rivera murals painted there, which are still so famous. It's funny that we're talking about the DIA, Patsy, because I don't know if you know this, next month they're having a big get together at the DIA to mark the 10th anniversary of the city coming out of bankruptcy. As you probably remember, the DIA was on the block when they were trying to pay off the city's debts.
I know.
And the judge who came in there, I think it was Rosen, the grand bargain that he fashioned, saw to it that the city retained possession of the DIA and its collections, which was a massively important moment for the city of Detroit. If they had given that up, it would have just been psychologically 10 times worse than Motown going to California. It would have been a psychic blow. And I'm sure you can appreciate what a disaster that would have been for the city. It's hard to believe, but 10 years ago, that was the bankruptcy
I know.
already.
I
And
know. I,
people
I
passed
really
it.
was so worried about them doing something stupid like that because they
Yeah.
didn't take care of so many things, like they didn't take care of Hudson and other buildings and McGregor Public Library that they let go to ruin. Just cover it with plywood and let whatever nature happens, the snow coming down year after year. They left the books inside, and I knew all those books. I probably read every book in that library. Tell us a little bit more now. What's happened to the team? Why did it have this turnaround? First of all, William Clay Ford Sr., he had his problems. So all through those years that there was this, we don't know if it was a curse, but we had some really bad years there. How did he handle that? And then how did it change? What happened?
I think that to answer the question, let's go back to William Clay Ford. The rap on him was that he was loyal to the wrong people and stayed with them for too long. Mel Farr, the great running back, said the only bad thing you can say about Mr. Ford is that he's loyal to the wrong people. And I think that really encapsulated his problems. Russ Thomas was his general manager for 22 years, widely reviled by the players, including Bubba Baker, among others. Then along comes Chuck Schmidt for 12 years, who ran off some great players, Lomas Brown, Chris Spielman, and then ultimately Barry Sanders, one of the greatest of all time. And then, worst of all, Matt Millen, who he stuck with for 7 years almost. And these were really bad general managers who kept the team down. They had some great individual players. And after 50 years, William Clay Ford died, and his widow, Martha Firestone Ford of the Firestone Rubber Fortune, took over the team for 10 years. And then, to everyone's surprise, instead of passing it along to her son, Bill Jr., she gave it to her daughter, Sheila. And that is the beginning of the answer to your question, I think, because as I mentioned a little while ago, at first she had some rough going. Her first 2 years the first year was pretty much a disaster. The second started off badly. And then midweek, after about the fifth or sixth game of the season, she shows up at the Allen Park practice facility, and the reporters were surprised to see her. She rarely shows up there. I was talking to one of them, Sean Windsor, at the Free Press the other day, who was among them, and they all rushed up to her with their tape recorders and their notebooks, and they said, "What's going on?" And then she just launched into this unprompted, unscripted monologue about what was going on in her head. And she says, "Are the fans frustrated? Yes. Am I frustrated? Yes. But I believe in the people I've put in place here. I believe in our system. I believe in the players they've drafted. It takes time. We're building it the right way through the draft, not through trades. It's going to take time. We have to wait for these players to mature. But don't push the panic button. Stick with it, because I believe in these guys, and this is going to turn around." And it turned around almost that day. They lost the next game, but then they went on a tear, almost made the playoffs that year, and then, of course, had the great year in 2023. And I think the answer to your question, Patsy, is this. Sheila has turned the team around because, as she said at that little impromptu press conference, she believed in her people. She believed in the system that they had put in place. And the reason was because she believes in herself. And I think that's the crux here. And her father, unfortunately, didn't really have that kind of a compass. He never believed in himself. Yes, he stayed with some bad people too long, but he also was firing coaches sometimes twice in a year. It was like a revolving door in the coach's office. The quarterbacks came and went. There was always quarterback trouble after Bobby Layne, until Matthew Stafford came along, and then he wanted out after a while. I think that was it. I think the fact that she had a sort of steel inside of her, and a belief in herself and in what she was doing, and the patience to wait, and it paid off. And that's what turned that team around.
Of course, she has quite a background herself. When we talk about steel, she actually comes from, it's incredible, being a Ford, but then her mother, Firestone.
Oh, I've always been intrigued by that. The idea of a tire company and a car company marrying. It's two of the biggest fortunes in America. And it's a mind-boggling to think about. And Bill Ford grew up in incredible luxury at Gawker Point, the estate that Edsel and his wife and Eleanor built. And that's now an historic home, and people can tour it. It's an amazing place. But Bill grew up with incredible wealth. He was the biggest stockholder in the Ford Motor Company, and marries a woman who's an heiress to a huge fortune of her own. And then I started the book, and I thought, well, a lot of the problems with the Lions were the fact that Bill Ford grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth and never really had to have a job. After he left Ford Motor Company, he did very little with the car company. And he never had to prove himself in the world, and he failed to prove himself with the Lions. And then I thought, wait a minute. Sheila didn't exactly grow up in a public housing project. She was born into fabulous. And she was in the first class of women at Yale, her father's alma mater. She came along during the feminist era, a very strong-willed, competitive, smart woman who did the homework, did the legwork, learned the ropes of the NFL and the committees and the business side of it, so that when her mother was ready to pass the reins, she was there. She was ready to go. And I think Martha did a brave thing by taking the gamble on the daughter rather than the son. And I just learned recently, after I finished writing the book, that when Martha Ford passed the team's ownership onto her daughter, it was the first time in league history that a woman owner had passed ownership to another woman. So the Lions have something, a nice little something else to be proud of. The women are running the show, and they're doing a better job than the men ever did. Which I think is kind of interesting. Yeah.
Women who are Lions fans, they are passionate about the team, and we really
Oh,
care
man.
about them. And it doesn't matter, as you said, all around the world. I would be in London, I would be in Paris. One time, I found somebody in a cafe in Paris reading the Detroit Free Press.
Whoa.
Oh my I do. I gravitated to that guy so fast. He didn't know I was very young then, and I saw the guy, and he had obviously just landed that day because he's still carrying the Free Press, which is to me still the only. I relate to that newspaper. The minute I see it, to me, it's the newspaper. He was in the cafe, and I sat down next to him, and I said, "Are you from Detroit?" Because that's how we are. So I can see really why Sheila is passionate about the Lions. Have you met her?
No, I have never. I tried to do interviews with both Sheila and Bill Ford Jr., and they declined to be interviewed, that's their business. But one of the chapters in the book is called Private People, and it's about the culture of the Ford family. They've been in the press a lot. It's not like they're recluses, but they're private people. And that was one of the things that one of the theories about why Barry Sanders left early, other than the fact that he was in disputes with the general manager, Chuck Schmidt, was the other big players like Emmitt Smith and the big star running backs around the league. They were treated as partners by the owners. It was a new era. There was free agency. There was salary caps. There was, and the other teams were treating their people differently. And the Ford family was never warmed up to that intimacy between ownership and players that a lot of the other teams had. And I think that the Lions suffered for that. That's just the nature of the Ford family. And certainly of Bill Ford. I'm not so sure about Sheila. I think that the vibe is completely different around the place now from what I've seen. But yeah, it's a funny thing, the family's relationship to the team and how that it can benefit or harm them. I think a lot of people like Barry Sanders, it ended up driving him away. That's a real shame because he was on the threshold of all-time records and he just walked away from the game.
What do you think of this year's lineup?
You shouldn't ask me because I'm not a real football wizard. I don't really know all that much about the game. When I set out to write the book, I'm basically a newspaper reporter at heart. I'm not a sports guy. And I just went and did the legwork and found the stories and interviewed the people that I needed to. But I'll tell you, a smart guy who you should ask that question of is Dave Burkett, who is a Lions beat writer on the Free Press. And I bumped into him last year at I believe it was the Carolina game at the press box at Ford Field. And I interviewed him on the phone. And so I walked up and introduced myself. And we were chatting. And I said, so what do you think is going to happen this year? And he says, I think they're going to win their division. And I think they'll have a home playoff game. I'm sorry, this was last season. I think they'll have a home playoff game. And they might win that. And that's exactly what happened. And although they got a lot closer to the Super Bowl than even he had predicted. So I saw him before the kickoff of the Rams game at the beginning of this year, when I mentioned I'd met Uper woman, Jackie Stefanski, at her seat down by the field. And I saw Burkett in the press box. And I said, so what's going to happen this year, Dave? And he says, I think they're going to go to the Super Bowl. I don't think they're going to win it, but I think they're going to make it. And I thought, this guy really knows his stuff. And I thought that if I had to refer to somebody who really knows their stuff, I would say, listen to that guy because he was right last year. Maybe he's going to be right again this year. I don't think it's far-fetched. I think they could do it. Look at the Tigers, what the Tigers have done this year. It's crazy.
And I think the ticket sales, the prices of Lions tickets are much higher than they were. There was a period there where I don't think they were selling that many tickets.
It's funny. I bumped into a guy who I quote in the book named Dave Tremblay, a retired pipe fitter from GM from Windsor, Ontario. He was cooking weenies and chili before that Carolina game last year. And I got to talking to him and then interviewed him several times for the book. And he had been a season ticket holder since right after Ford Field opened, I think since 2003. They raised the ticket prices last year during the playoff run. They announced the new 2024 ticket prices. And there was a sizable jump because they had made the playoffs finally. And I said to Dave, I said, so are you going to renew your season tickets? And he says, yeah, I don't want to bail out now after all the bad years. He says, I noticed they're raising the prices now that they're good, but I didn't get any kind of a discount when they were 0-16. And I thought, that the dry Canadian wit. His point was well taken. These fans have been through so many lean years. And that 0-16, I believe it was 2006. That was or maybe 2008. That was 2008. That was the year that the tight end for the Lions was a guy named Dan Campbell in his last playing season, who's now their head coach. Dan Campbell knows about how Detroit people have suffered through bad seasons. The first time ever that a team went 0-16, and the current coach was the tight end on that team. So he's got the Detroit DNA in him to a big extent, and I think that's helping the team actually.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah. I think it's a wonderful book for so many reasons. You have a chapter that's RESPECT, respect. People didn't always give us respect, but it's paid off, and I think we're happier now. But it doesn't really matter for those of us who love Detroit, who want Detroit to just thrive and be great again. I still say I come from Detroit. I'm a Youper, but I come from Detroit. And people say, oh, that sounds terrible. And I say, oh, no, I remember the streets lined with elm trees, and it was so beautiful. And I think it's going to come back.
I think you're right.
I think so. And I love your book. It's fun in so many ways. You mentioned Motown. You already mentioned that. And that was a tragic thing, I think, when they left. I think they shouldn't have gone. Detroit is great. The book is wonderful. I think you've done a beautiful job. I'm really so thrilled that you joined me today. It's just brings back so many fond memories. Everybody, this book is really fun. I'm sure if you read this book, you're going to tune in to the Thanksgiving Day game, right? The real Thanksgiving Day.
Chicago Bears.
The original. This is the Detroit Lions. That's the original Thanksgiving Day game. You have to watch that one. The others don't count to me.
That's right.
Right? Again,
that's
thank
right.
you so much.
Thanks for your kind words. I really appreciate this, Patsy.
You're a great author, and wow, this book is terrific. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. Woo! What can I say? Detroit. This is a wonderful book, and I'm so happy that Bill Morse was able to join me today. It is just always fun for me to talk about Detroit. I know that he's going to be at a big conference up in Traverse City, and all of the fans of the Detroit Lions, it was worth it. We waited years and years, and now it's going to be an exciting new season for the Detroit Lions. Now, please, everyone, if you could, please subscribe. I love to talk to authors. As you see, I had so much fun talking to Bill. And so please subscribe, share, and comment. Especially comments. Authors really appreciate getting comments. So please subscribe, share, and comment. Thank you for joining me today. And get this book. It's a great read. Bye-bye now.
Turn the house down.